A bear cub was left crying in the rain. What an old wolf did after hearing him will melt your heart. The sound cut through the storm like a blade through cloth, a high, desperate wail that didn't belong to any creature the old wolf knew. He lifted his grizzled head from where he'd sheltered beneath the overhang of granite, his ears swiveling toward the noise. Rain hammered the forest in sheets, turning the world into a blur of gray and green. But the cry came again, closer now, raw with the kind of terror that transcends species. The wolf's lip curled instinctively, exposing teeth worn down by 17 winters, and he rose on stiff legs. His pack was gone, scattered by famine, lost to hunters, claimed by the slow erosion of time. He was alone. He should have ignored the sound. But something in that cry, something ancient and undeniable, pulled him forward into the deluge. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The Cascade Mountains wore their autumn colors like a warning, reds and golds that screamed of the winter coming, of the hunger that would follow, of the desperate final weeks when every creature fought for survival. The forest that stretched across the northern slopes was old growth, the kind that had stood for centuries. Douglas firs reaching heights that dwarfed the younger trees at their feet. Hemlocks clustered in the shadows where the light barely reached. It was a place of deep silence, broken only by wind and water, by the occasional scream of a hawk or the hollow drumming against dead wood. The wolf's name, if wolves could be said to have names, was something like a memory of smoke. Gray Smoke, his former pack might have called him, for the color that had overtaken his once black coat. But names were human conceits, and Gray Smoke thought of himself only as what he was, old, alone, and enduring. He had been born in these mountains, had run with a pack of 12 at his prime, had fathered 3 litters and taught his pups the language of the hunt. He had brought down elk twice his size, had defended his territory against rival packs, had howled at moons so bright they turned the snow to silver. That was another life. The sickness had come 5 winters ago, something the humans called distemper, spread by their dogs that wandered too far into the wild. It took the young ones first, the pups who hadn't yet learned to avoid the strange animals that smelled of human hands and rubber and poison. Then it took the yearlings, then the adults. Gray Smoke watched his mate die over the course of 3 days, her body seizing, her eyes filming over, her breath rattling in her chest until it finally stopped. He watched his children scatter, those who survived seeking new packs, new territories, new chances at life that didn't include a father too old to lead them. He should have followed, should have challenged for dominance in another pack or died trying, which was the way of wolves. But something in him had broken along with his pack, some essential piece that made solitude preferable to submission. So he stayed. He hunted alone, catching rabbits and squirrels, fishing in the shallow streams when the salmon ran, scavenging from the kills of younger predators who were too cautious to challenge him. It was not a good life, but it was life. The storm had blown in from the Pacific that morning, one of the early autumn tempests that announced winter's approach. Gray Smoke had smelled it hours before the first drops fell, that particular heaviness in the air, the way the birds went silent and the small mammals rushed to their burrows. He'd found shelter in a familiar place, a shallow cave formed by 2 massive boulders that leaned against each other, creating a dry pocket just large enough for his body. He'd weathered storms here before. He would weather this one. But then came the crying. At first, he thought it might be a cougar cub. They sometimes made sounds like that when separated from their mothers. But cougars didn't cry with that particular rhythm, that rising and falling desperation that spoke of something young and lost and utterly alone. Deer fawns, perhaps? No, the sound was too low, too rough. A coyote pup? Wrong pitch entirely. Gray Smoke stood at the entrance of his shelter, rain immediately soaking his face and shoulders, and he turned his head slowly, triangulating the sound. Southwest, perhaps 100 meters, in the thick of the forest where the undergrowth grew dense and the going was treacherous even in good weather. Every instinct told him to return to the shelter. Young things die in the wild. That was the way of things. Whatever was crying out there was not his concern, not his responsibility, not his problem. He was old. He was tired. He had earned the right to conserve his energy, to choose his battles, to let nature take its course without his interference. But the crying continued. And something in that sound, something he couldn't name, made him think of his own pups, the ones who had died, the ones who had left, the ones he would never see again. He moved into the storm. The forest floor had turned to mud, treacherous and slick, and Gray Smoke's paws struggled for purchase as he descended the slope toward the sound. Branches whipped at his face. Water ran in streams down the hillside, carving new channels, washing away the familiar scents that might have guided him. Every instinct told him to return to the shelter. Young things die in the wild. That was the way of things. Whatever was crying out there was not his concern, not his responsibility, not his problem. He was old. He was tired. He had earned the right to conserve his energy, to choose his battles, to let nature take its course without his interference. But the crying continued. And something in that sound, something he couldn't name, made him think of his own pups, the ones who had died, the ones who had left, the ones he would never see again. He moved into the storm. The forest floor had turned to mud, treacherous and slick, and Gray Smoke's paws struggled for purchase as he descended the slope toward the sound. Branches whipped at his face. Water ran in streams down the hillside, carving new channels, washing away the familiar scents that might have guided him. But the crying grew louder, and he followed it with the same focus he'd once used to track wounded prey. He found the cub in a hollow at the base of a massive cedar, partially sheltered by exposed roots, but still exposed to the worst of the rain. The cub was brown, a deep, rich brown that would have been beautiful in sunlight, but looked almost black in the storm. He was small, perhaps 3 months old, his fur plastered to his body, making him seem even smaller. His eyes were squeezed shut against the rain, his mouth open in continuous cries, and his paws, absurdly large for his body, the way bear cubs' paws always were, scrabbled uselessly at the mud. A bear cub. Gray Smoke stopped at the edge of the hollow, his body rigid with the sudden understanding of what had found. Bears and wolves were not enemies in the way that wolves and cougars were, or wolves and other wolves. They occupied different niches, hunted different prey, avoided each other with the mutual respect of creatures who understood that conflict served no purpose. But they were not friends either, and a bear cub, even one this young, represented the potential for danger, not from the cub itself, but from the mother who would be nearby. Gray Smoke scanned the surrounding forest, his nose working despite the rain that washed away most scents. No mother. No adult bear smell at all, recent or otherwise. The cub was alone. This was impossible. Bear mothers did not abandon their cubs. They were fiercely protective, would fight to the death to defend them, would teach them through their first year and often into their second before sending them off to fend for themselves. For a cub this young meant one of 3 things. The mother was dead, the mother was dying nearby, or the cub had somehow become separated during the storm. Gray Smoke watched the cub cry. He should leave. This was not his concern. If the mother was alive, she would return, and she would attack anything she perceived as a threat to her offspring, even an old wolf with no hostile intentions. If she was dead, the cub would die too. That was simply the mathematics of survival. A 3-month-old bear could not feed itself, could not defend itself, could not survive a night alone in the cold. The cub's cries were weakening. The little creature was exhausting itself, spending energy it didn't have, and Gray Smoke could see the trembling in its body that meant hypothermia was setting in. In another hour, maybe less, the cub would fall silent. In 2 hours, it would be dead. Gray Smoke took a step backward, toward the shelter, toward sense and safety, and the solitary life he had chosen. The cub opened its eyes. They were brown, dark, and deep, and even through the rain, even across the distance, Gray Smoke felt the weight of that gaze. The cub looked at him not with fear, it was too young to know what a wolf meant, but with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or hope. The desperate, irrational hope of a creature drowning and suddenly seeing land. The cub tried to stand. Its legs folded beneath it. It fell, rolled onto its back, righted itself with tremendous effort, and tried again. This time it managed to stay upright, swaying dangerously, and it took one stumbling step toward the wolf, toward Gray Smoke, toward the one thing in the forest that had stopped to listen to its cries. The old wolf felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, which had already broken years ago when his mate died, but something deeper, some final defense, some last wall between himself and the world, some barrier he had erected to keep from caring too much, feeling too much, losing too much. He moved forward. The cub fell again before he reached it, collapsing into the mud with a small, defeated sound. Gray Smoke approached cautiously, still scanning for the mother, still half expecting an attack from the shadows. But there was nothing. Only the rain and the wind and this small, dying thing at his feet. He lowered his head and sniffed the cub. The smell was bare, warm and musky, and nothing like wolf, but underneath it was something else. Fear, exhaustion, the beginning of death. The cub didn't move away. It simply lay there, breathing rapidly, trembling violently, and looked up at the wolf with those deep brown eyes. Gray Smoke made a decision that defied every law of the wild, every instinct carved into his genes over millions of years of evolution. He picked up the cub. His jaws closed around the small body with the same gentleness he'd once used to carry his own pups, his teeth finding the loose skin at the nape of the cub's neck without breaking it. The cub let out a startled squeak, but didn't struggle. Perhaps it didn't have the strength. Perhaps some deep mammalian part of its brain recognized being carried and submitted to it automatically. Or perhaps it simply understood, in the way that very young animals sometimes do, that this was help. Gray Smoke turned and began the climb back to his shelter, the cub hanging from his jaws, its small body adding almost no weight to his burden. The rain continued to fall, the storm continued to rage, and an old wolf carried a bear cub through the forest, toward a shelter that would barely fit them both, toward a future that made no sense, toward something that could only be called mercy. When they reached the cave, Gray Smoke set the cub down gently on the driest patch of stone he could find. The cub immediately tried to crawl closer to him, seeking warmth, seeking the comfort of a body that wasn't alone. Gray Smoke hesitated, then lay down, curving his body around the small bear, sharing his heat. The cub pressed against his belly, and for the first time since Gray Smoke had found him, the crying stopped. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains. Inside the shelter, a wolf and a bear cub lay together in the darkness, and the world, for just a moment, made a different kind of sense. This was the proposition the forest offered. Save this small thing and complicate your remaining days, or let it die and remain alone. Gray Smoke had chosen. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The cub slept for 14 hours straight. Its small body pressed so tightly against Gray Smoke that the wolf could feel every breath, every heartbeat, every small tremor that passed through it as dreams played behind closed eyes. Gray Smoke did not sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to the rain gradually diminish from a roar to a whisper to nothing, and he tried to understand what he had done. He had saved a bear. The absurdity of it should have been overwhelming. Wolves did not save bears. They avoided them, respected them, sometimes scavenged from their kills when opportunity presented, but they did not form attachments. Bears were solitary creatures once they left their mothers, territorial and dangerous, capable of killing a wolf with a single swipe of their massive paws. This cub would grow. In a year, it would weigh as much as Gray Smoke. In 2 years, it would weigh twice as much. In 3 years, it would be a fully grown black bear, 400 pounds of muscle and claws and teeth. And if Gray Smoke lived that long, unlikely, he would be even older, even weaker, even more vulnerable. What was he supposed to do with a bear cub? The question had no answer. So Gray Smoke did the only thing he could do. He waited for morning. Dawn came softly, the sun breaking through the clouds in shafts of pale gold that transformed the wet forest into something almost beautiful. The storm had stripped leaves from the trees, scattered branches across the forest floor, filled every depression with water that reflected the clearing sky. It was the kind of morning that promised the world had been washed clean, that everything could begin again. The cub stirred against Gray Smoke's belly, making small grunting sounds, and then suddenly its eyes opened. They were clearer now, more focused, and they fixed on the wolf with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so young. The cub should have been afraid. Gray Smoke's face was inches from its own, his teeth visible even with his mouth closed. His yellow eyes containing all the threat of a predator 17 years practiced in killing. But the cub did not flinch. Instead, it did something that surprised Gray Smoke so completely that he didn't know how to respond. It licked his nose. The gesture was pure cub, the kind of thing bear cubs did to their mothers, a mixture of affection and a request for food, and a simple acknowledgement of presence. It meant, in the language of bears, "I know you. You are safe. I am hungry." Gray Smoke pulled his head back, confused, and the cub tried to follow, crawling forward on unsteady legs, still making those small grunting sounds. When it reached the edge of Gray Smoke's body, where the warmth ended and the cold stone began, it hesitated and let out a small, uncertain cry. The wolf sighed, a long, resigned exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his soul, and shifted position, creating a new warm space for the cub to occupy. The cub immediately crawled into it, pressed itself against Gray Smoke's chest, and made a sound that could only be described as contentment. They stayed that way for another hour, the wolf and the bear, neither quite knowing what to do with the other, but unwilling to break the connection that had formed in the night. Finally, Gray Smoke's hunger became impossible to ignore. He needed to hunt. But he couldn't leave the cub alone, not yet, not when it was still so weak, still so vulnerable. He tried to stand. The cub immediately panicked, scrambling to its feet and following him, crying again, that same desperate sound from the night before. Gray Smoke turned and looked at the small creature, and in that moment he understood the trap he had created. The cub had imprinted on him. In the absence of its mother, in the terror of the storm, in the warmth of rescue, the cub had chosen Gray Smoke as its parent. This was not a rational choice. Cubs did not think that way, but an instinctive one, a survival mechanism encoded in their biology. The first large, warm creature that protected them became mother, became safety, became the center of their world. Gray Smoke was now the center of this cub's world. He tried to leave anyway. He walked toward the entrance of the shelter, and the cub followed, stumbling over rocks, slipping on the wet stone, but following with single-minded determination. Gray Smoke walked faster. The cub tried to keep up, failed, and let out a wail so piercing that Gray Smoke's ears flattened against his skull. He stopped. The cub caught up, panting, and immediately pressed itself against Gray Smoke's leg, still making distressed sounds. And the wolf understood with perfect clarity that there was no leaving the cub behind. Not today. Maybe not ever. He looked down at the small brown body, at the oversized paws and the round ears and the button nose, and he made his second impossible decision. He would teach the cub to follow. The first lesson was simple: stay close, but stay silent. Gray Smoke walked in slow circles around the clearing outside the shelter, the cub trailing behind him, learning the rhythm of his movement. When the cub cried out, Gray Smoke would stop and look back with what he hoped was a stern expression. When the cub stayed quiet, even for just a few steps, Gray Smoke would pause and allow it to catch up, would touch his nose to the cub's face in what might have been approval. It took 3 hours, but eventually the cub understood. It could follow, and following meant staying with the warm creature, staying safe, staying alive. The crying stopped, replaced by a focused silence broken only by the sound of small paws on wet earth. The second lesson was harder, learning to be still while Gray Smoke hunted. They found a rabbit warren near a fallen log, the fresh dirt at the entrance suggesting recent activity. Gray Smoke positioned the cub behind a screen of ferns with a look that he hoped communicated, "Stay here and don't move," then approached the warren with the practiced patience of a predator who could no longer rely on speed. He waited. The cub, to his surprise, also waited, its eyes fixed on the wolf, its body trembling with either cold or excitement, but making no sound. When the rabbit finally emerged, Gray Smoke took it in a single swift motion, his jaws closing around its neck before it could even squeak. He carried it back to the cub, dropped it at the small bear's feet, and waited to see what would happen. The cub sniffed the dead rabbit, uncertain. Bears were omnivores, capable of eating meat but preferring fruits, nuts, insects, and vegetation. A 3-month-old cub would still be nursing, would not have been introduced to solid food beyond what it might have sampled while watching its mother forage. But the cub was hungry, desperately so, and hunger makes its own rules. It tried to bite the rabbit. Its teeth were too small, too weak. It pawed at the body, managed to tear off a small piece of fur, and chewed on it without success. Finally, it looked up at Gray Smoke with an expression that seemed to say, "What do I do with this?" Gray Smoke took the rabbit back and tore it open, exposing the soft meat inside. The smell of blood and flesh filled the air, and the cub approached cautiously, sniffed, then began to eat. Its technique was clumsy, more tearing than biting, but it managed to consume a significant portion of the rabbit before its small stomach was full. When it was done, it licked its paws clean with a small pink tongue, then looked up at Gray Smoke and made a sound that was almost like a purr, a low, rumbling expression of satisfaction that resonated in its chest. The wolf ate the remainder of the rabbit in 3 efficient bites, then led the cub to a nearby stream to drink. The water was cold and clear, swollen from the rain, and the cub approached it cautiously, as if unsure what it was looking at. Gray Smoke waded in and began to lap at the water, and the cub, watching, imitated him. It lost its balance almost immediately, splashing face first into the stream, and came up sputtering and shaking its head. Gray Smoke, if wolves could be said to have expressions, looked amused. The cub tried again, more carefully this time, and managed to drink without falling. When it was done, it shook itself vigorously, spraying water everywhere, then looked inordinately proud of this accomplishment. They returned to the shelter as the sun began to set, and the cub immediately curled against Gray Smoke's belly, making that purring sound again. The wolf lay still, feeling the small body's warmth, listening to its breathing deepen into sleep, and he tried to imagine what the coming days would bring. He would need to hunt more frequently. One rabbit was not enough to feed them both. The cub was growing, would need more food each day, and winter was coming. He would need to find better shelter, something larger, something that could accommodate a bear that would soon be too large for this small cave. He would need to teach the cub to find its own food, berries, insects, roots, all the things that bears ate but wolves did not. He would need to become something he had never been. A teacher not just of hunting, but of survival. And not for a wolf, but for a bear. The absurdity of it made something in his chest feel both heavy and light at the same time, as if he were carrying a great weight that somehow made him stronger rather than weaker. Outside, an owl called into the gathering darkness. Inside the shelter, a wolf and a bear cub slept, and the forest, in its ancient wisdom, accepted this impossible thing and moved on. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that defied nature but somehow worked. Gray Smoke and the cub, whom the wolf had begun to think of as Small Bear, though he never spoke the name aloud, became a unit of two, moving through the forest in tandem, learning each other's languages, adapting to each other's needs. Small Bear grew rapidly, as bear cubs do. Within a month, he had doubled his weight, his coat growing thick and glossy with the proper nutrition Gray Smoke provided through constant hunting. The oversized paws no longer looked quite so absurd, and his movements became more coordinated, less clumsy. He learned to climb trees with an ease that Gray Smoke could only watch with something like envy, his small claws finding purchase in bark that would not support a wolf's weight. He learned to turn over logs and rocks, snuffling underneath for insects and grubs, supplementing the meat that Gray Smoke brought with the foods that his bear biology craved. But more than the physical growth, Small Bear was learning something else. He was learning to be a wolf. He shadowed Gray Smoke everywhere, mimicking the wolf's posture, his careful scanning of the environment, his method of moving through underbrush with minimal sound. When Gray Smoke hunted, Small Bear learned to wait downwind, to remain still until the moment of the strike, to approach the kill only after Gray Smoke had made certain it was dead. He learned the meaning of different sounds the wolf made, the low warning growl that meant danger, the soft chuff that meant safety, the howl that meant loneliness, or the marking of territory, or simply the need to hear one's own voice in the vastness. He tried to howl himself. The results were absurd. A sound halfway between a wolf's cry and a bear's grunt, pitched all wrong, lasting too long. But Gray Smoke never corrected him. He simply howled, and Small Bear howled beside him, and together they announced to the forest that they were here, they were alive, they were something new. Other animals noticed. The ravens that followed Gray Smoke's hunts, waiting for scraps, began to recognize the odd pair, wolf and bear, moving together, sharing kills, defying every expected pattern. The deer grew wary, confused by the hybrid hunting strategy that sometimes resembled a wolf's patient stalking and sometimes resembled a bear's opportunistic foraging. The squirrels chattered warnings that seemed to contain no words for what they were witnessing. And the other wolves noticed too. They came one morning when the first snow was threatening. A pack of 5, young and strong, moving through Gray Smoke's territory with the confidence of animals who believed it was no longer guarded. Their leader was a female, her coat a deep rust color, her eyes sharp and calculating. Gray Smoke scented them before he saw them, and he immediately positioned himself between them and Small Bear, his lips pulling back from his teeth, his hackles rising. The rust-colored female stopped at a distance of perhaps 20 meters, her pack fanning out behind her, and she studied Gray Smoke with an expression that mixed curiosity with disdain. She was perhaps 5 years old, young enough to be his daughter, if any of his daughters had survived, and she carried herself with the authority of a wolf who had never lost a challenge. She looked from Gray Smoke to Small Bear, who was partially hidden behind the old wolf's body, and her head tilted in question. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. The sound was not truly laughter, not the way humans would understand it, but a series of short, sharp barks that communicated amusement, disbelief, contempt. Her pack joined in, their barks echoing through the forest, and Gray Smoke felt something he had not felt in years: shame. He understood what they saw: an old wolf, past his prime, alone and strange, keeping company with a bear cub as if it were a pup, playing at being a father to something that was not even his species, pretending at a life that had already ended when his real pack died. The rust-colored female took a step forward, and her expression changed from amusement to challenge. She wanted this territory. She wanted the hunting grounds, the den sites, the water sources that Gray Smoke had claimed and defended for years. And she believed, probably correctly, that she could take them. Gray Smoke should have backed down. The mathematics were clear. 5 to 1, young to old, a pack with coordination against a lone wolf whose reflexes had slowed and whose strength had waned. Fighting would mean death, and death would mean leaving Small Bear alone, unprotected, unable to survive. But Gray Smoke did not back down. He stepped forward, matching her challenge, and his growl was low and deep and carried within it all the fury of a life that had been taken piece by piece, loss by loss, until nothing remained but this: one old wolf and one small bear, and the absolute refusal to surrender the only thing he had left. The rust-colored female's amusement vanished. She crouched, ready to spring, and her pack moved closer, surrounding Gray Smoke and Small Bear in a loose circle that would tighten into a killing box in moments. Behind Gray Smoke, Small Bear made a sound. Not the cry of fear, not the purr of contentment, but something new, a low, rumbling growl that was pure bear, pure warning, pure threat, despite coming from something that weighed perhaps 60 pounds. The rust-colored female's eyes flicked to the cub, and something in her expression changed. Confusion, perhaps? Or recognition of something she did not quite understand. A wolf protecting a bear made no sense. A bear defending a wolf made even less sense. But the bond between them was visible, undeniable, and it spoke to something older than pack structure, older than territorial disputes, older than the rules that governed a forest. It spoke to family. The female held Gray Smoke's gaze for a long moment, and he could see the calculations running behind her eyes. She could win this fight. She would win this fight, but it would cost her. Injuries to her pack, possibly a death, certainly the kind of damage that would make them vulnerable to other challenges. And for what? Territory that would still be there next month, next year, after the old wolf finally die of age, if nothing else. She stepped back. Her pack, confused, looked to her for guidance, but she turned and led them away without another bark, without another challenge. Gray Smoke watched them go, his body still rigid, his teeth still bared, and he did not relax until their scents had faded completely from the air. When he finally turned, Small Bear rushed to him, pressing against his legs, making distressed sounds, checking the old wolf for injuries with his small paws. Gray Smoke stood still and allowed it, and something in his chest unclenched slightly. They had survived, together. But the encounter had revealed a truth that Gray Smoke could no longer ignore. Small Bear was growing, and the forest was noticing. Other animals, both predators and prey, were watching this strange partnership, trying to understand it, trying to decide what it meant for them. Some, like the rust-colored female, might be satisfied with simply avoiding them. Others might not be so accommodating. And there was a larger problem, one that Gray Smoke had been pushing to the back of his mind but could no longer avoid. Small Bear was learning to be a wolf, but he was not a wolf. He was a bear. And bears lived differently, required different things, followed different instincts. Eventually, those instincts would clash with what Gray Smoke was teaching him. The fracture had not happened yet, but its inevitability hung in the air like the promise of winter. It came 3 weeks later, during the first real snowfall. Gray Smoke had led Small Bear to a slope where the salmon ran in autumn, their bodies struggling upstream to spawn and die. The run was mostly over, but there were always a few late fish, and Gray Smoke had thought to teach Small Bear the technique of fishing, something wolves rarely did, but bears excelled at. The water was frigid, the current strong, and Gray Smoke waded in carefully, his old joints protesting the cold. He demonstrated the technique. Stand still, watch for the dark shape of a fish, strike quickly when it comes into range. Simple in theory, difficult in practice. Small Bear watched from the bank, making uncertain sounds. Gray Smoke caught a small fish and brought it to shore, dropping it at the cub's feet as encouragement. Small Bear ate it enthusiastically, then looked at the river as if seeing it properly for the first time. He waded in. The current immediately pushed against him, stronger than he expected, and he lost his footing. The water was not deep, perhaps 2 feet, but for a young bear, that was enough to be dangerous. Small Bear went under, came up sputtering, and was swept several meters downstream before Gray Smoke could react. The wolf lunged into the current, fighting against the water's force, and managed to grab Small Bear by the scruff of his neck. He pulled the cub to shore and dropped him on the bank, and Small Bear coughed up water and shook himself and looked at Gray Smoke with eyes that held something new. Fear of the wolf. Not fear of the situation, not fear of the river, but fear of the creature who had just grabbed him with teeth that could kill, who had dragged him with a strength that could not be resisted, who was suddenly not father, but predator. The moment passed quickly. Small Bear's rationality, such as it was, reasserted itself, and he pressed against Gray Smoke in gratitude and relief. But the wolf had seen that flash of fear, that instant of recognition that they were not the same, that the relationship between them was built on trust that could shatter. That night, back in their shelter, a larger cave they had found a week prior, Gray Smoke lay awake while Small Bear slept. He could hear the wind howling outside, the first true winter storm announcing itself, and he thought about the future with a clarity he had avoided until now. Small Bear would grow. He was already growing. In another month, he would be too large for Gray Smoke to carry. In another year, he would be too large to need Gray Smoke at all. Bears denned through winter, sleeping through the cold months, while wolves hunted and traveled and survived on whatever they could kill. When spring came, Small Bear would wake with instincts that told him to roam, to mark his own territory, to find a mate, to be the solitary preacher that bears were meant to be. And Gray Smoke would be even older, even weaker, even closer to the end that came for all animals if they lived long enough. This story had an ending, and the ending was separation. The thought should have brought relief. He had saved the cub, had given it a chance at life it would not have had otherwise. That was enough. That was more than enough. When the time came to part ways, he could return to his solitary existence, his simple routine of hunting and sleeping and waiting for death, without the complication of caring for something that was not his own. But instead of relief, what Greysmoke felt was something else. Loss. He had lost his pack, lost his mate, lost his children. He had survived all of it by closing off the part of himself that could be hurt by absence. But Small Bear had reopened that place, had made him feel again, had given him something that resembled purpose. When Small Bear left, Greysmoke would return to being alone. But this time, he would know exactly what he was missing. The wind howled, the snow fell, and an old wolf and a young bear slept together, neither knowing how few peaceful nights remained before the world demanded they become what they were supposed to be, rather than what they had chosen to become together. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. The winter arrived in full force, transforming the forest into a landscape of white and gray and deep silence. Greysmoke had expected it to be harder, had expected the cold and the scarcity of prey and the endless work of hunting in snow that sometimes reached his chest, but Small Bear made it easier. The young bear, following the instincts written in his blood, showed signs of wanting to den, to find a cave or hollow log and sleep through the worst of the winter. But he did not den. He stayed with Greysmoke, moving through the snow, helping hunt in his clumsy bear way, his thick coat and layer of fat making him more resistant to the cold than the old wolf. They became efficient together. Greysmoke's experience, combined with Small Bear's strength, created a partnership that surprised them both. When they tracked deer through the snow, Greysmoke would drive the prey toward Small Bear, who had learned to hide behind trees and strike when the moment was right. His swipe might not kill. He was still young, still learning, but it would wound, would slow, would allow Greysmoke to make the final strike. They brought down 3 deer that winter, an impossible achievement for a lone wolf Greysmoke's age, and they ate well. Small Bear grew rapidly. By midwinter, he weighed nearly 150 pounds, his body taking on the stocky, powerful shape of an adolescent bear. His coat had thickened into a luxurious pelt that shed water and cold with equal ease, and his claws had grown long and curved and deadly. He could tear open logs that Greysmoke could only scratch at, could reach honey in high places that the wolf could only dream of, could intimidate smaller predators with just his size and presence. But he still slept pressed against Greysmoke at night, still made that purring sound when content, still followed the old wolf with the devotion of something that had never learned to be independent. This could not last. Greysmoke knew it. Small Bear, in his bear way, probably knew it too, but neither acknowledged it, and so they moved through the winter together, pretending that spring would never come. It came anyway. The thaw started in early March, the snow melting into rivers that swelled the creeks and filled the air with the sound of rushing water. The world turned from white to brown to green with shocking speed. And with the change came the animals emerging from their winter dormancy. Chipmunks and squirrels, birds returning from the south, and bears. Other bears. Greysmoke scented the first one near what he still thought of as his territory, a large male making his way through the forest with the ponderous confidence of something that feared nothing. The wolf positioned himself downwind with Small Bear beside him, and they watched the larger bear pass. Small Bear was rigid, his nostrils flaring, taking in the scent of his own species for the first time since the storm, since the night Gray Smoke had saved him. The young bear made a sound, soft, uncertain, something between a grunt and a whine, and took a step forward, toward the large male. Gray Smoke's teeth closed gently around Small Bear's ear, a warning and a reminder. That male was dangerous, would likely attack Small Bear for wandering into his territory, would certainly attack Gray Smoke for being a wolf. Small Bear stopped, looked back at the old wolf, and something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps, or a question. What are I? Gray Smoke had no answer. They avoided the male bear, but in the days that followed, they encountered others. A mother with 2 cubs foraging for early shoots. A pair of adolescent siblings wrestling and tumbling in a clearing. A massive female, her body lean with hunger, tearing apart a rotten stump in search of insects. Each time, Small Bear would stop and watch, his entire body focused, and each time, Gray Smoke would guide him away. But the pull was there, the recognition, the call of blood that said these were his kind, these were what he was meant to be. One morning, Small Bear did not return from his morning exploration. Gray Smoke waited at their current denning site, a hollow beneath a fallen cedar, and when an hour passed with no sign of the young bear, the wolf set out tracking. The trail led west, into a part of the forest they had not yet explored, and Gray Smoke followed it with growing unease. He found Small Bear in a berry clearing, standing perfectly still, staring at something. Gray Smoke approached cautiously and saw what had captured the young bear's attention. Another bear, perhaps 2 years old, a female, feeding on the early berries that were just beginning to ripen. She had noticed Small Bear, but did not seem threatened, simply curious about this stranger in her feeding ground. Small Bear took a step toward her. The female huffed, a sound that was not quite aggressive, but certainly wary, and Small Bear stopped. He huffed back, a perfect imitation of bear communication that he had somehow never needed to learn, that was simply written into his being. The female relaxed slightly and returned to feeding, and Small Bear, moving slowly, approached and began to feed from the same bushes. Gray Smoke watched from the tree line. He could have interrupted, could have called Small Bear back with a sound or a presence, could have reminded the young bear who had raised him, who had saved him, who had taught him everything he knew, but he did not. Because what he was witnessing was not betrayal. It was inevitability. Small Bear was a bear. He belonged with bears. And no matter how deep the bond between wolf and cub had grown, no matter how much they had learned to be family, nature had its own plans. Gray Smoke turned and walked away. He did not run, did not slink, simply walked with the dignity of a wolf who understood that some things could not be held on to, no matter how tightly you clenched your jaws. He returned to the den alone. The space felt enormous without Small Bear's bulk, empty in a way it had not felt since the night he had brought the cub home from the rain. Gray Smoke lay down in the entrance, where he could watch the path, and he waited. Small Bear did not return that night, nor the next morning. On the third day, Gray Smoke forced himself to eat, a rabbit he caught mechanically, without passion, and he considered his options. He could track Small Bear, could try to bring him back, could attempt to maintain the bond through sheer force of will, or he could accept what was happening and release the young bear to his own life. The choice should have been obvious, but the heart, even a wolf's heart, does not operate on logic. On the fourth day, Gray Smoke heard the sounds. They came from the east, roaring, crashing, the unmistakable noise of animals in combat. And underneath it, almost drowned out but still audible, a sound he recognized immediately. Small Bear, crying out in pain and fear. The old wolf was running before he consciously decided to move. He found them in a narrow ravine, the walls steep and rocky, the bottom filled with broken trees and boulders. Small Bear was backed against the stone, blood streaming from wounds on his face and shoulder, facing two adult males. One of them, the large bear Gray Smoke had seen days ago. They had cornered the young bear, had injured him, and were now closing in for the kill. This was the way of bears. Young males who wandered into the wrong territories, who challenged the wrong opponents, who did not yet know the boundaries and rules, often died. It was natural selection, the pruning of the weak and the unlucky, the brutal mathematics of survival. But Gray Smoke did not care about natural selection. He launched himself from the ravine's edge, a blur of gray fur and ancient fury, and struck the nearest male bear from behind. His teeth found the bear's ear and tore it partially away, and the bear roared in shock and pain and wheeled to face this new threat. The second male, the larger one, also turned. For a moment, all four animals froze in a tableau that made no sense. Two adult bears, one adolescent bear, and one old wolf, all bloodied, all breathing hard, all calculating their next move. Then the larger male charged. What followed was not a fight, but a miracle of stubbornness. Gray Smoke could not win against two adult bears. He likely could not win against even one. But he did not need to win. He just needed to create enough chaos, enough damage, enough uncertainty that the males would decide this young bear was not worth the cost. He dodged the first swipe, felt the wind of it pass inches from his face. He darted in beneath the second swipe and bit at the bear's foreleg, his teeth finding tendon and muscle. The bear howled and shook him off, sending Gray Smoke tumbling against a boulder, and the old wolf felt something in his ribs crack with a sound like a breaking branch. Pain exploded through his chest, stealing his breath, but he forced himself to stand. The smaller male was approaching now, and Gray Smoke snarled at him with every ounce of defiance left in his body. Behind the males, Small Bear had recovered enough to stand, and the young bear was roaring now too, his voice deeper than Gray Smoke remembered, more mature, more dangerous. The smaller male hesitated. This was not worth it. A young bear with a wolf protector, both willing to fight to the death, both too unpredictable. He backed away, then turned and fled up the ravine. The larger male watched him go, then looked at Gray Smoke with an expression that might have been respect, or might have been simple calculation. The wolf was injured, dying perhaps, but still standing. The young bear was injured too, but gaining confidence, his size no longer something to dismiss. The large male huffed once, a sound that meant he was withdrawing, not out of fear, but out of pragmatism, and followed his companion out of the ravine. When they were gone, when their heavy footsteps had faded into the forest, Gray Smoke allowed himself to collapse. Small Bear was beside him instantly, making distressed sounds, licking the wounds on the old wolf's face, trying to nuzzle him back to his feet. But Gray Smoke could not stand. The pain in his ribs was overwhelming, and when he tried to breathe deeply, he tasted blood. He looked up at Small Bear, and in that moment, he saw not the cub he had saved, but the bear the cub had become. Powerful, independent, capable of surviving without him. This was what Gray Smoke had worked toward, even if he had not acknowledged it. This was success. Small Bear made a decision then, visible in the way his body shifted, the way his eyes focused. He grabbed Gray Smoke gently by the scruff of the neck, role reversal, the rescued becoming the rescuer, and began to drag the old wolf out of the ravine. It was slow, agonizing work. Gray Smoke's body was heavy with the weight of age and injury, and the ravine slope was steep. But Small Bear did not give up. He pulled and rested, his bare strength finally proving its worth. And when they reached the top, when they were back on level ground, Small Bear continued dragging Gray Smoke towards something the wolf did not immediately recognize. A den. Not their old den, but a new one. Larger, more sheltered, with a spring nearby and berry bushes visible from the entrance. A place Small Bear had found, perhaps had been preparing, perhaps had intended to move to when he fully committed to leaving. He pulled Gray Smoke inside, positioned him on the softest patch of earth, then lay down beside the old wolf, pressing his bulk against the broken ribs as gently as something his size could manage. Gray Smoke closed his eyes. The pain was fading, replaced by a strange lightness, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was dying. The internal injuries were too severe, his body too old to heal from this kind of trauma. He had hours, perhaps, maybe a day. But he had also succeeded. He had saved Small Bear one final time, had given the young bear the chance to truly become what he was meant to be, had loved something wild and impossible, and had been loved in return. That was enough. Small Bear made a sound, that old purring rumble, the sound of contentment, and Gray Smoke felt the vibration through his broken body. Outside, the forest continued its ancient rhythms. Inside the den, a wolf and a bear lay together in the growing darkness, and the world paused to witness this ending, this beginning, this impossible thing that had defied nature and emerged victorious anyway. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. Gray Smoke did not die that day, nor the next day, nor the day after that. The injuries should have killed him. The broken ribs, the internal bleeding, the shock to a system already weakened by age. But something in him refused to surrender. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the warmth of Small Bear pressed against him. The young bear's steady presence a reminder that there was still something in the world worth staying for. Or perhaps it was simply that his story was not quite finished. He drifted in and out of consciousness for a week, and each time he woke, Small Bear was there. The young bear brought water, carrying it in his mouth in soaked moss and dripping it onto Gray Smoke's tongue. He brought food. Fish caught from the nearby stream, tender shoots that bears loved but wolves usually ignored. Even once a small rabbit that he had somehow managed to catch and kill with his clumsy bear hunting. He cleaned Gray Smoke's wounds with his rough tongue, kept the old wolf warm through the cold nights, and growled warnings at any creature that approached their den. Slowly, impossibly, Gray Smoke began to heal. The pain in his ribs diminished from agony to a dull ache. His breathing cleared. His appetite returned, and with it some small measure of strength. By the end of the second week, he could stand for short periods. By the end of the third, he could walk to the spring to drink on his own. He would never be what he was. The injuries had taken too much, but he was alive. And Small Bear had stayed. Not out of obligation, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The young bear could have left at any point during Gray Smoke's recovery, could have joined the other bears, could have begun his own life. But he did not. He stayed, and in staying, he completed his transformation from cub to something else. A guardian. The female bear returned one morning, the same one Small Bear had met in the berry clearing weeks ago. She approached the den cautiously, huffing her presence, and Small Bear emerged to meet her. Gray Smoke watched from the entrance, his body still too weak for confrontation, but his eyes sharp, assessing. The female and Small Bear circled each other, their body language speaking volumes in the way that animals' communication always does. She was curious about him, about this bear who smelled like wolf, who moved differently than other bears, who lived in partnership rather than in solitude. Small Bear was curious too, but wary, protective of the den and the old wolf inside it. They did not fight. Instead, after several minutes of this careful dance, the female huffed once, acceptance, and wandered to the berry bushes to feed. Small Bear watched her for a long moment, then returned to the den, pressed against Gray Smoke, and made that purring sound. Not yet, the sound seemed to say. I'm not ready yet. Gray Smoke understood. Small Bear was caught between two worlds, the bear he was becoming and the wolf he had learned to be. The female represented one path, a return to his species, a normal life, cubs of his own eventually, the solitary existence that bears were meant to lead. Gray Smoke represented another, the bond they had built, the partnership that defied nature, the family they had chosen. Eventually, Small Bear would have to choose, but not today. The summer came, bringing abundance. The forest exploded with life. Berries ripening on bushes, fish running in the streams, deer giving birth to fawns that were easy prey for the first few weeks. Gray Smoke regained more strength, enough to hunt small game on his own again, though he tired quickly and relied increasingly on Small Bear for the larger kills. They fell into a new rhythm, different from before but comfortable. Small Bear would forage during the day, eating the vegetation he needed, and Gray Smoke would rest, conserving his energy. In the evenings, they would hunt together, combining their skills to bring down prey that neither could take alone. At night, they would return to the den and sleep pressed together, two bodies keeping each other warm, two species making their own rules. Other animals began to recognize them. The ravens stopped being surprised by their partnership and simply followed them as they followed any predator, waiting for scraps. The deer learned to watch for both bear and wolf simultaneously, their warning calls becoming more sophisticated, more specific. Even the other bears gave them a wide berth, perhaps sensing that these two were different, were dangerous in their coordination, were not to be challenged lightly. And gradually, Small Bear began to venture further from the den. At first, it was just short explorations, an hour here, 2 hours there. Then half a day. Then full days where he would leave at dawn and return at dusk, smelling of forest and river and sometimes of other bears. Gray Smoke did not try to stop him. He understood that this was necessary, that Small Bear needed to learn his own territory, establish his own boundaries, become his own bear. But each time, Small Bear returned. One evening in late summer, when the light was golden and the air was thick with the smell of ripening berries, Small Bear came back to the den with the female following behind him. She was cautious, stopping well back from the entrance, but her presence was clear. She wanted to be near Small Bear, wanted to be part of whatever strange life he had built here. Gray Smoke emerged from the den and looked at her. She looked back, her eyes holding no hostility but plenty of wariness. They were natural competitors, wolf and bear, and only Small Bear's presence kept this moment peaceful. The old wolf made a decision then, one of the hardest of his life. He turned and walked away from the den, not fleeing, not abandoning, but giving space. Giving Small Bear permission to build something new, something that did not include him at the center. He walked for perhaps half a mile, following an old game trail, and he found a spot on a ridge where he could see the forest spreading out below him. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and red, and for a moment, Gray Smoke simply stood there, breathing the evening air, feeling the weight of every year he had lived. He had been born in this forest. He had lived a full life here, had known love and loss, victory and defeat, companionship and solitude. He had raised pups of his own, and, impossibly, had raised a bear cub who was not his own. He had fought battles and survived storms, and defied every expectation of what a wolf could be, should be, was supposed to be. And now, perhaps, it was time to let go. He heard movement behind him, and turned to see Small Bear emerging from the trees. The young bear approached slowly, deliberately, and when he reached Gray Smoke, he sat down beside the old wolf and looked out at the sunset. They sat together in silence for a long time, watching the light from the sky. The female had not followed. Small Bear had chosen to come alone, had chosen this moment to be just between them. Finally, Small Bear made a sound. Not the purring, not the grunting, but something new. A low, mournful call that seemed to contain everything. Gratitude, love, grief for what was ending, hope for what was beginning. Gray Smoke answered with a howl. It was quieter than his howls used to be, rougher, broken by his injuries and his age, but it carried nonetheless. It spoke of the same things Small Bear's call had spoken of, and it added one more: pride. Pride in what the cub had become, pride in what they had built together, pride in having lived long enough to see this impossible thing through to its conclusion. When the howl faded, Small Bear leaned against Gray Smoke one final time, his massive bulk dwarfing the old wolf now, his warmth familiar and constant. Then he stood, looked at Gray Smoke with eyes that held understanding, and walked back toward the den, toward the female, toward his own life. Gray Smoke watched him go, and he did not follow. The seasons turned once more. Gray Smoke found a new shelter, smaller, simpler, suited to a solitary wolf who no longer needed space for a growing bear. He hunted what he could, scavenged what he couldn't, and survived through another winter. He saw Small Bear occasionally, from a distance. The young bear had claimed territory not far away and could sometimes be spotted fishing in the streams or foraging on the slopes. Small Bear always acknowledged him, a look, a sound, a brief moment of recognition that said, "I remember. I am what I am because of you." And then he would return to his life, to the female who had become his companion, to the solitary but not quite alone existence that bears lived. In the spring, Gray Smoke heard something that made his old heart lift, the sound of cubs. Small Bear's cubs, born in a den somewhere in the forest, their high-pitched cries carrying on the wind. 2 of them, by the sound of it, maybe 3. Gray Smoke never saw them. Small Bear kept them hidden, as bear fathers do, leaving the raising to the mother while he ranged the territory, marking boundaries, defending resources. But knowing they existed, knowing that Small Bear had found his way to be fully what he was meant to be, that was enough. One morning in late spring, when the forest was green and alive and everything smelled of growth and possibility, Gray Smoke woke to find Small Bear outside his den. The young bear, no longer young really, but fully grown, massive and powerful, had brought a salmon, freshly caught, and dropped it at the entrance. Gray Smoke emerged slowly, his body stiff with age and old injuries, and looked at the gift, then at Small Bear. The bear huffed once, a sound that might have meant anything or everything, and turned to leave. "Wait," Gray Smoke's body language said. Small Bear stopped. The old wolf approached the massive bear, reached up, and touched his nose to Small Bear's face, just as he had that first night in the rain, when the cub had been small enough to fit in his jaws. Small Bear rumbled, that old purring sound, that expression of contentment, and returned the gesture.
his massive head lowering to press gently against the old wolf's. They stood that way for a long moment, two creatures who had no business loving each other, who had broken every rule the wild had written, who had survived anyway. Then Small Bear turned and walked away, back toward his own territory, his own family, his own life. Gray Smoke watched until the bear disappeared into the trees, then turned to the salmon and ate. It was the best meal he had had in months, and he savored every bite. The forest continued its ancient patterns around him: life and death, growth and decay, predator and prey, all moving in their eternal dance. But within that pattern, new stories emerged, small variations on old themes, moments when the rules bent just enough to allow something impossible to survive. A wolf had saved a bear had saved a wolf. They had loved each other across the boundaries of species, had protected each other against the wild's indifference, had given each other reasons to live when living seemed pointless. And now, in the spring sunshine, with cubs crying in a distant den and salmon running in the streams, the story had come full circle. Gray Smoke finished his meal, cleaned his paws, and lay down in the sun. His body was failing. He knew this, could feel it in the way his heart stuttered and his breath came short, but his spirit was at peace. He had lived a full life. He had loved deeply. He had made a difference in the world, had saved a life that should have been lost, had been saved in return. And when the darkness finally came for him, weeks later, on a morning when the birds were singing and the forest was alive with summer, Gray Smoke closed his eyes with a final thought: the cub survived. That was enough. That was everything. In the forest, a bear taught his own cubs to fish, to forage, survive in a world that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And sometimes, when the wind was right, he would stop and lift his head toward a distant ridge where an old wolf had once stood, where a shelter still remained, where a bond had been forged that would never quite fade. He would rumble, a sound of remembrance, of gratitude, of love, and then return to his life, carrying with him always the lessons learned from a creature who should have been his enemy, but instead became his father. The cycle continued. The story went on. And in the Cascade Mountains, where everything ends and everything begins, the rain fell once more, washing the world clean and preparing the earth for whatever impossible things might come next.